All right, welcome to the fourth installment of chapter number 2. We have 3 guided reading questions that you're going to be able to answer at the end of this video. I believe they're questions 12, 13, and 14. Things like what crops transformed the Caribbean. That should be answered relatively quickly. How important was it for the British? Then we're going to discuss the motivations behind settling the Carolinas. Why did they want to do that? And then finally, what were some early challenges for the Carolinas? What challenges did they have to kind of incorporate? Now we're going to answer that first question pretty quickly. We did go from the Caribbean to the Carolinas. Remember, we talked about explorers like Christopher Columbus really found the Caribbean first and settled the Caribbean first. Now eventually there's going to be a reason that we move. We're going to talk about that in a minute. The goal of the English when they found the Caribbean after the Spanish kind of reach it and have settlements is they really want to rob the Spanish. That was kind of their original intent. But they stumble onto something else that they find extremely profitable, and this is this idea of sugar, growing sugar. So if anybody asks what crops transformed the Caribbean, I would say sugar would be the one I would put down. And why is this so important? Well, frankly, it's money. Sugar makes more money for England than all other commodities combined that the American colonies are producing. So sugar becomes far and away the most profitable of commodities that we have going on. So this kind of ingratiates the Caribbeans to the English. Now slavery in the Caribbean kind of patterned a little bit like we saw in the Chesapeake. Starts out with white indentured servants and then moves to black slaves. The conditions of the slavery was brutal. By all accounts, this is probably, not there's any great place to be a slave, but these are probably the harshest of conditions to be a slave. There were no kind of family. We kind of talked about this in the last video. Plantation owners in Virginia thought that if a slave had a child, that's again another commodity that they could own. So they had slaves for life. In the Caribbean, the mortality rate was so high that they didn't feel the need to have women slaves because they couldn't do the amount of work that men could, and they really didn't want them to have kids because slaves died so frequently. It really was, and this is pretty disgusting to say, but it was an economics thing that they felt they could get 5 to 6 years out of a slave before they died because they pushed them to the brink and they just overworked, they worked them to death. That it really didn't pay to invest in like female slaves to have kids, because kids, it took a lot longer to get, I guess, their investment back, so to speak. Working on a sugar plantation was really labor intensive. Once you started the process, they needed to kind of continuously work. So they literally worked slaves to death. It was a pretty rough place to be. Like, you were worked past exhaustion into, having some serious health problems. There were many slave uprisings in the Caribbean, so stronger slave codes were enacted in order to kind of stop them, to provide some deterrence for slaves to kind of come up with that idea. There was not a lot of land, honestly, in the Caribbean. There was at a point once, when people kind of caught on that they could make money from the sugar, it had more immigrants kind of showed up. They ran out of land. I mean, if you look at any island, it's a small area, so they ran out of land, so much so that even those indentured servants that showed up there was no opportunities for those once they worked off their servitude, if they got to that point. So there was a lack of opportunity for land. That was a major problem. Now, people that landed in the Caribbean realized that, hey, if you went a little farther west, there's a lot of land. So there becomes kind of this plot between these two characters. William Berkeley, who we talked about, was the governor of Virginia, who wanted to expand because of the overcrowded population of Virginia. And this other guy, Sir John Carleton, who was exiled to an island in the Caribbean, really saw the overcrowding that was going on in the Caribbean, and decided, like, hey, I want to expand. I want to go somewhere else. So they kind of got together and they realized that there was land south of the Virginia colonies that they could expand into, and they do. So there's a lot of reasons they went into this land. If you're not sure what is south of Virginia, it's the Carolinas. So there's a lot of reasons for doing this. One, obviously, is this overcrowding. Lots and lots of overcrowding. Not only in the Caribbean, but there was overcrowding in Virginia. Virginia really felt like they wanted to have a place to expand to. So they felt like they needed more land and more opportunity. So there was overcrowding, just the unrest of the Caribbean, the fact that there were slave uprisings, and that made some people nervous. That was a problem. Just the overpopulation of Virginia, like we talked about, just in general, horrendous conditions that were available in the Caribbean. This is all reasons to kind of go to Carolina. Now, in 1663, Charles II makes these two guys, William Berkeley and John Colton, makes them joint proprietors of the Carolinas. So by doing that, this gives them all the land kind of in the Carolinas. Now, when it was given in 1663, that included North Carolina and South Carolina. About 40 years later, they would split up those colonies into the North, which became North Carolina, and the South, which was South Carolina. In this joint proprietorship, Charles II kind of says that there's going to be a governor that's going to represent the Carolinas and a representative assembly. So that's kind of what's kind of going on. Now, there's some things that allow for some early struggles in both these places. Now, we're going to look at the two separate. The struggles in the Carolinas really are different for the northern portion, which, like I said, 40 years later would become North Carolina, and the southern portion, which would become South Carolina. In North Carolina, they had a real problem because there was a lack of harbors, rivers, and ports to ship their goods places. So this became a major problem. North Carolina, because of this, was an extremely poor colony. There was a very small population. A lot of people didn't want to go there. It was tough to do some of these cash crops, like because they had a small population, they didn't have a place to ship all the extra stuff. So most people engaged in general farming, just enough to get by. They produced like tar and turpentine. Again, just general things. It wasn't a really prosperous colony. Now, in the South, it was much more prosperous, much more potential. What would be South Carolina was kind of governed by a man named Sir Anthony Ashley Cooper, who profits from a lot of the extensive ports and rivers that are present in South Carolina. They become the most wealthy colony in North Carolina eventually. Anthony Ashley Cooper, basically there's all these rivers that converge, and he names his kind of major city Charlestown after Charles II. Now, if you've ever been to South Carolina, Charleston is a pretty predominant, pretty big city. That was originally called Charlestown, so becomes Charleston. Now, South Carolina does have some issues as well. To get people there, they figure people are going to want to flock there. They have liberal land grants, so they figured, hey, everybody's going to get land. We have representative government. They preach religious toleration. What happens is this Cooper feels like what's going to happen is they're going to give land to certain proprietors that are going to run these sections of South Carolina. All of those proprietors then would get what's called a quatrain, which is a fee for utilizing their land that would be paid to proprietors. This leads to, as you might guess, a lot of corruption. A lot of people paying the fee are like, why do you get to be the proprietor? Like, what gave you that right? So there's a lot of political unrest that happens. There's a lot of religious fighting that happens in South Carolina too. Because they're a little more wealthy, it does draw immigrants, but from a lot of different spots. And a lot of different kinds of religions, like Baptists and Presbyterians are there, not just Protestants and Catholics like we've had earlier. So there is a lot of religious fighting. That's a problem. So South Carolina has some political unrest, a lot of religious fighting. They have a very interesting landscape, and there's a lot of swamp land, which is absolutely why rice becomes a staple product. And again, it makes them very, very wealthy. It's great for growing rice. However, not so great for people. That's all that standing water and swamp spreads like disease, like yellow fever, and leads to a lot of death among people. So it's not a great people place. A good economic and rice producing place, not great for people. At least back then it wasn't. Isolation. Plantation owners lived in relative isolation. There wasn't a lot of people close by, not a lot of socializing. It was said the main form of socializing was going into Charleston or Charlestown at the time, to sue somebody or to settle some sort of argument. That was a lot of your socializing. There were a lot of threats in South Carolina. Threats from the Spanish, who were in Florida. So South Carolina, if you know where that's at on the map, it's relatively close to Florida, to the south. And then in kind of the Gulf region, like in Louisiana, which is kind of off to the west, there was a lot of French that were settling in there. So there were threats from the Spanish and the French that were kind of encroaching. There was also threats from Native Americans. There was something called the Yamasee War, which was a Indian tribe that attacked, with the help of the Creek Indians, attacked the white settlers in South Carolina, almost pushing them out of South Carolina. If it wasn't for help from the Cherokees, who had kind of allied with white settlers because of trade agreements and what have you, might have been a far different story. But there was threats from those Indian tribes, the Yamasee and the Creek. So there was some real issues kind of there. Now there are some things that happened. Like, everybody realized that they had to kind of come together, because South Carolina was a very isolated place, a very divided place because of all these things, religion and different political kind of background and all of those things. They did eventually unify, and a lot of it was the foreign threats from Native Americans, and they were all extremely fearful of uprising from slaves because of the adoption of rice as the major cash crop in South Carolina. Well, growing rice is a very labor-intensive process that increased the amount of slaves that were needed on these big plantations. At one point, I believe it was like the 1730s, the African-American population actually outnumbers the white population in South Carolina. So the plantation owners are very fearful of the potential of a slave uprising. And this kind of brings plantation owners together. And just like we've seen other places, it really increases the severity of punishments for any slave that steps out of line. The slave codes are much, much stricter, and it's a unifying of plantation owners, again, looking out for each other's quote unquote property. So it's unifying, not necessarily for the greatest of purposes, but it was unifying, I suppose. That is kind of the conclusion of the fourth section. There'll be one more video. We'll talk about that soon. So I will see you then.